It's blowing in the wind again, it's drifting in the rain. Before the dead have molded yet, or wounded healed their pain. I am so old, my grandsons, that I remember when I marched to hail the armistice, and I was barely 10. That was the war against all war, to save democracy. Praise God, they said, we've won the peace for all eternity. I marched again when some years passed, and marched and marched, and then there was the war to end all war, and so I marched again. I marched in Minneapolis, Chicago, and Duluth, in San Francisco and New York. I marched to shout the truth. I marched in Hiroshima and knelt before a stash of tens of million bones of people atomized to ash. And with the distant rumble of new regiments of men, I read the warning on the tomb, this must not be again. I marched to staunch Korea's blood, I marched for Vietnam. I marched to stop the napalm, and I marched to stop the bomb. I've marched and marched and marched, oh Lord, I'm sure I've done my due. I've marched since I was barely 10, and now I'm 72.
The interviews that form the foundation for this program were conducted as part of a class and by volunteers over a period of several years, beginning in 1979. We wanted to know what inspired these women, how they came to be committed to progressive political action. We began to piece together a history of the local branch with a diversity of concerns. Among them are teachers, homemakers, scientists, library workers, and accountants, many the children of immigrants. They have juggled the demands of family, community service, and political organizing, sometimes at very real peril. They are women of conscience, modest about their contributions, strong in their commitments. This program represents only part of the rich histories of the women interviewed and of WIL. In gathering the stories of these local peace activists, we have come to appreciate oral history as a valuable tool for filling in gaps in the historical record, for documenting the lives of those left out of most history textbooks, and for developing a personal sense of connection to the past, its living presence in people of the community. Through talking with these women and hearing their stories, we came to understand with special force the continuity of history from generation to generation, and the roles ordinary people play in history. We see in their lives many of the political, social, and personal struggles of our own lives. WIL was founded in 1915 during the First World War, when women from neutral and warring nations met at The Hague, Netherlands, seeking ways to end hostilities and build international communication among women. The first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize, Jane Addams, founder of Chicago's Hull House, and her friend Emily Green Balch, also to win the Nobel Prize, were among its founders and served as its first presidents. Active in the suffrage movement and concerned about the status of women in all nations, the early League members set in motion a strong international organization, now a non-governmental organization within the United Nations, to provide women a forum for discussion and action. The League's activities focus on issues of self-determination of all peoples, improved living standards, disarmament, and other interrelated goals. The Peninsula branch held its first meetings at a local veterans building, now a California historical site. Members were also involved in activities of the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence. For years, office space was in the old Peace Center on Lytton Avenue in Palo Alto. In 1982, the Peace Center found a new home at a local church, where WILP shares its space with other community groups, which form strong coalitions on a variety of issues. Millie Livingston talked about her hopes for peace and freedom through WILP, then celebrating its 65th anniversary. She says, "We've struggled for 65 years. I'm sure we'll struggle for the next 65. My hope is that we'll get to the main important things, which are peace and freedom. That doesn't mean just an absence of war, but it means freedom to live, and a good environment, and to have enough food, and have a roof over your head, and to have something meaningful to do. Meaningful work. It's very idealistic, and it's very utopian, but people can do it." In our interviews, we wanted to learn what inspired these women, how they came to be committed to progressive political action. Their reasons were varied. Alice Richards talked about some of the effects on her life. It is really hard to decide what the priorities are, although I think one criteria would be what will have an effect on changing society. I was trying to think what made me a nonconformist. My parents were nonconformists in certain ways. My mother stood up for all sorts of things that were not too popular. Birth control. She helped found a birth control clinic in Santa Barbara. And when Libby, he was a pacifist minister, wanted to speak, and they wouldn't let him speak at somebody's house, she let him speak at our house. Lucy Hassler's mother was an active pacifist and feminist. They marched together in a suffrage contingent in a parade from the White House to the Capitol. They wore white with sashes of purple and gold, the colors of the National Women's Party. They were in the gallery of the House of Representatives when war was declared on Germany. Jeanette Rankin, the first woman to be elected to the House, cast her vote against war and said, "I love my country, but I cannot vote for war." In 1941, Jeanette Rankin voted again against war. In 1968, Jeanette Rankin led the Jeanette Rankin Brigade of 4,000 women who petitioned the Congress on opening day to demand an end to the war in Vietnam. Lucy was there that day, too. She says, "Now, more than ever, women must use the vote." Esther Newell grew up in a socialist family in New York. As a little girl, she was once sent out by her mother to collect coins for some cause in a tin. She came home with an astonishing number of coins. Some of her first political memories are of political oppression. Sacco and Vanzetti. As a child, I knew about injustice to Sacco and Vanzetti. Knowing that these things happened to grown people when I was a child, and knowing that people had commitments, such as my mother's, to fight against this kind of thing, I suppose whenever I came across any kind of injustice, I reacted to it, on the premise that you could do something about it. Barbara Gatto became aware of injustice during the war when the Japanese were interned, and after the war when political alliances were redefined. After World War II was over, people started talking about the next war with Russia. She remembers a magazine article that came out after the war about what we'd do, what were the street targets and all of that. And I mean, they had been our allies. And I was so shocked by this. Didn't people have enough war? I was learning some of the hard facts about my own country, the Japanese Americans and everything. And also the turnaround. First the Russians are our friends, and then they're our enemies. I grew up in an era when Chinese and Japanese were the yellow peril. And then all of a sudden the Chinese were our noble allies, and the Japanese were terrible. But it made me realize that what had happened in Europe with the Jews was not the fact that the Germans had worse character than the Americans, but that we could do just as bad, that it was possible. Doris Jones became aware of discrimination against black people in her own community. She worked in the early 1960s with the ACLU and the NAACP as a housing checker, uncovering housing discrimination. I went to check one time, and we were looking for a one-bedroom apartment for a young couple with a baby. And I had told this woman that I was looking for an apartment for my son, who was moving down from Berkeley with his wife and small child. You always had to be sure you got the children in there, or something at least as undesirable as anything they could complain about. It was such a hot day. I was shown 14 apartments before I finally begged off. I said, "Well, I've got the idea, and I'm sure that one of these will be satisfactory, and I'll bring him around sometime." I was just about to drop. We went back to the rental office, and the young man that I was really looking for the apartment for, was there. And she turned to him and right in front of me said, "I'm sorry, we don't have any one-bedroom apartments." Dumb things like that. The next time I had to go to that apartment house, this manager threatened to throw me in the pool. I spent a hot afternoon with the agent who was handling that building. He told the people up in San Francisco, because they really put up a terrific fuss about that particular apartment building, that it wasn't so much the black tenants they objected to, but that goddamn woman from the NAACP. They didn't want to have to deal with her anymore. Consciousness of the evils of war motivated the women to work for peace. Stella Polya, active in the international office of WILPF in Geneva, before she and her husband left for America just after World War II, talks about warfare. The First World War was over, and I was impressed how awful it had been. So many young people were dying, and so many were just in the trenches. People started to realize that war is something evil. It was not before. You admired the soldiers and officers with their beautiful uniforms. It was a game, war. There was a war long before between the French and the English. The battle started. The French stood on one side, the English on the other. And then the French commander said, "Commencez, please start." And then they started the battle. It was a kind of game at that time. Marion Wachtel, who served with her husband, the commander of the U.S. regiment, the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, in the Spanish Civil War, talks about her experiences in Spain. The Spanish Civil War was the first chance to oppose Hitler where a person could lay it on the line, and the American public was for the Spanish Republic. And Roosevelt said later the biggest mistake he ever made was to deny arms to the Spanish Republic. You don't have very many chances to carry out your ideals on a broad scale. There aren't any more deeds of daring do. However just she may have thought the Spanish Civil War to be, it was war, frightening and terribly destructive. I've never been in a shelling, and it is the most awful, terrifying thing I've ever known, because it just seems to suck all the air out, and then it's all around you. I was frozen, absolutely frozen with fear. And then my first reaction, as soon as I got over the fear, was anger. I was so furious, those bastards up there shelling civilians. That's all they could attack, because they couldn't do anything else. Oh, I just let out a string of profanity. Stella Polya and her husband sheltered refugees from Hitler. WILPF started an organization for refugees who came to Switzerland without permission. They were desperate, and they just swam over the Rhine. There was an official organization to help the Protestants, the Catholics, the Jews, the Social Democrats. There was no organization to help the pacifists. And we tried to find a place where they could stay. We had a chalet, and we had there all the time refugees. Those women who raised families in the 1950s, when the bomb became part of their children's lives, wrestled with the question, how do you explain war and the atomic bomb to children? Margaret Stein tried to answer some of her daughter's questions. Yes, she was just tiny, 3, when she found this little book called Let There Be a World by Felix Green. And he talked about the victims of the atomic bombing. We had really tried to keep that out of her sight. There were some horrible pictures in it. But somehow she found it, and she asked what they were, and so I tried to explain about the atomic bomb to a 3-year-old, that we had dropped it, and that's what happened to people who are near it, and that we must make sure we never did it again. And she said, "Well, Mom, what are you doing about it?" WILPF members did a lot about a lot of issues. The Vietnam War era was a particularly active period for most branches. Millie Livingston describes some of the branch activities. We initiated the Feed the Cities, Not the Pentagon program for the League, which involved lobbying the city, the mayors of all the cities in the country. We went to conventions and we lobbied them to support the transfer amendment, which would transfer unnecessary funds from the military budget to human needs. So we initiated that. We worked on that most of the time. We took part in all demonstrations that were happening for the Vietnam War. We had press conferences, and we wrote letters, and we had leafleting. We would go to a different shopping center every other week and leaflet. And we had a vigil at Union Square for every week. Women stood out there with signs and leaflets all during the war, and we did draft counseling. In their work to end war and militarism, promote peace and a safe environment, branch members have combined protest with community education. They wrote letters to the local press, their legislators, and other public forums on important issues. Betty Mitchell sent a drawing by Shelby Stover to her local Cooperative Markets newsletter. The drawing showed a silhouette of a woman kissing her child. The text said, "What do you do in case of a nuclear accident? Kiss your children goodbye." It generated quite a controversy. Was the co-op newsletter the place for political issues? One co-op member said, "Not one fatality has been recorded in 20 years of nuclear plant operation. We ecologists must remain alert against those who oppose the movement with false emotional threats to safety." But a WILP member, Ann Sims, responded to that comment by saying, "When 500,000 Californians, including thousands of Bay Area co-op members, signed petitions to get the nuclear initiative on the ballot, it's not surprising to find co-op news carrying the discussion forward. Thank you." Doris Jones has worked since the 1960s to end the military draft, and works with renewed vigor in the 1980s against registration. She talks about her work during the 1960s. "We start out there at 8 o'clock in the morning when the draft board opened. When I went, I would park my car directly outside the draft board. And I would go down with those cartons of literature and put the boxes on the trunk lid. And I would sit out there and dole out literature. And we were there for 2.5 years. We never missed a shift. Plus, when there were busloads of inductees going up to the induction center, those buses left at 6 o'clock. We were there at 6 o'clock for last-minute pleas to them. Think what you're doing. Take a few minutes and go into the draft counseling office, which was right across the street from the induction center in Oakland." Elsie Rennie, a Quaker, went to demonstrations regularly with her 90-year-old father until he was unable to walk with her. They took part in silent vigils at the Stanford Shopping Center against the war. She says, "I went once distributing literature all by myself down University Avenue and to the Stanford Shopping Center, and they told me we had no business there. So I went down there again all by myself and had a bunch of literature and distributed it all. I did have one lady say to me one time, one little old lady even smaller than I am, she looked at me with such hatred in her eyes, and she said, 'I'd rather be dead than read.' I was somewhat taken aback at that. I didn't know what to say. Maybe it was just as well. Another time I had a grandmother come up and tell me she was so glad to see my bumper sticker. She said, 'We grandmothers don't want our grandsons to be drafted.' And I said, 'No way.'" Helen Hildreth tells her favorite story about a confrontation she had with a man at a demonstration. "Some real nice gentleman. He got so mad I thought he was going to have a stroke. He was so mad at me. Now, I was just standing there with this little sign that said, 'Think before you register.' And he wound up by, I forget all the rest, but he wound up by saying I was a vicious bitch." Margaret Stein's husband was arrested during a demonstration, and her daughter asked, "Why did they put Daddy in jail?" And the charge was disturbing the peace, and so I said, "Well, they said he was disturbing the peace." And she said, "But he wasn't. He was disturbing the war." The old Peace Center in Palo Alto, and other places where peace workers met during the Vietnam conflict, were the subject of bomb threats and break-ins. Lydia Callejo, who faithfully staffed the Peace Center office for 10 years, talks about those days during Vietnam. We had all kinds of threats. Bombs in Roy Kepler's bookstore. He was a peace activist and war objector. One time this person called up and wanted to know who were these peace groups at the Peace Center. And I said it was an informal organization. Anyone could belong. Well, then, she said, who were the different groups who are in it? Well, I said, there was the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. Oh, she said, the International League. So you're communist? There were threats constantly. But you know, the peace movement was so strong at that time that I remember them coming in, putting in the windows, and cleaning up, and keeping right on. Millie Livingston talks about Pioneers for Peace, WIL 1915 to 1965, which tells the history of the first 50 years of WILP. It tells about the women who were in Nazi Germany, WILP members, who worked with the underground and who were shot. When they were caught, they were shot. And it's hard to think of white middle-class women getting out there and putting their lives on the line. But a lot of them have. Despite risks, these women and WILP members internationally have worked for decades for the ideals of peace and freedom. Their vigor and perseverance inspire younger people concerned about the same issues. Lydia Callejo speaks about the involvement of young people in the Vietnam protest movement. She remembers a leaflet written by a high school student. Speaking of a moratorium on Vietnam, quote, "The moratorium is a protest against the war in Vietnam in which we are presently engaged, and a lament for the 30,000 American soldiers that have died without good cause and about which our government is doing so little. If you love your country, or if you care, march." Unquote. This was written by a 15-year-old boy. Beth Coates, new to political work and then a young mother, was encouraged by branch members to accept their nomination for president of the branch early in the 1960s. I accepted because it seemed to me that the WIL at that time, the women were almost all of them very old, and it seemed to me that the organization was a very worthwhile one, and if someone didn't do something quickly, it was going to die out. And so I decided that I didn't have anything to offer except being younger than most of them, but I figured that maybe that would help. They were all boasting about their brown-haired president. But many of them had been very active for their whole lifetime, working for peace, just years and years before I was born, most of them. To me, it was a marvelous experience to get acquainted with these women and learn about what they'd done and how they felt about things. She is no longer their brown-haired president, but a woman of the older generation in WILP, an organization that has continued to grow and reach out to involve new members in the struggle for a better world. We hope that this oral history project will carry these fine women's voices and dreams to other women and men and inspire them to work for social justice, peace, and freedom.
Do we kill people who are killing people to show that killing people is wrong? What a foolish notion that war is called devotion when the greatest warriors are the ones that stand for peace. War toys are growing stronger, the problems stay the same. The young ones join the army while General What's-His-Name is feeling full of pride that the army will provide. But does he ask himself why? Do we kill people who are killing people to show that killing people is wrong? What a foolish notion that war is called divorce. get thrown in prison while Warden, what's his name, is feeling justified. But when will he be tried for never asking why? Do we kill people who are killing people to show that killing people is wrong? What a foolish notion. War is called devotion when the greatest warriors are the ones that stand for peace. Children are so tender, they will cross the earth if they think they're saving a friend. They get drawn in by patriotic lies right before our eyes. They leave our home, and then they find out once they're all alone, they're asking the age-old question, why? What a foolish notion that war is called devotion when the greatest warrior